It is the 17th of September 1665. The Spanish king, Philip IV, known as El Rey Planeta, the Planet King, on account of Spain's vast global colonial empire, is dead. He ascended to the throne as a 15-year-old all the way back in 1621, meaning that his passing 44 years later is the end of an era. Within Spanish government circles there is concern, as Philip's heir is a boy who has not yet reached his 4th birthday. There will now be a lengthy minority reign as he grows up. More worryingly, the boy is ill, a victim of generations of inbreeding within the Habsburg royal dynasty. In time, his illness will become symbolic of Spain's decline, and his death will spark one of the worst wars in early modern European history. His name? King Charles II of Spain, the Bewitched King. The man known to history as King Charles II, or King Carlos II of Spain, was born on the 6th of November 1661 in Madrid. He was born into the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty, a royal family that had originated in the High Middle Ages along the Swiss-Austrian border and which had since come to rule over Austria and Spain as two different branches of the same family. Charles would be the last Habsburg king of Spain, and his death would trigger a major international conflict that lasted over a decade as Europe's great powers sought to decide who would succeed to his kingdom and Spain's vast colonial empire. Charles's father was King Philip IV of Spain, who ruled as the 5th Habsburg king of Spain from 1621 to 1665. His mother was Mariana of Austria. She was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III and Maria Anna of Spain, a younger sister of Charles's father. Such a marriage between uncle and niece was strangely typical of Habsburg dynastic policy in the 16th and 17th centuries, and this was not the only such marriage between an uncle and niece from the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburgs. The 11 marriages between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs during this period is commonly believed to have contributed to the health problems that plagued Charles II's life and which in turn led to the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line. The Habsburgs first came to power in Spain in 1506, when Philip IV, Duke of Burgundy, son and heir of the Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, became King of Castile following the death of his mother-in-law, Queen Isabella of Castile, in 1504. Through her marriage to King Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella had helped to unite the Spanish crowns of Castile and Aragon. Although Philip fell ill and died before being crowned king, his wife, Queen Juana, continued to reign as queen in her own right. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Philip and Juana's eldest son, Charles, became King Carlos I, or Charles I of Spain, better known to history as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He was the first direct ruler of Spain on the Habsburg side. As Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, and ruler of the Burgundian Netherlands, Charles not only ruled over the largest empire in Europe since the days of Charlemagne in the early 9th century, but also ruled over the rapidly expanding Spanish Empire in the Americas. When Charles abdicated in 1556, his eldest son, King Philip II inherited Spain and the Low Countries, while Charles's younger brother, Ferdinand, became Holy Roman Emperor and ruler of the Austrian territories. While Charles V hoped that the elective office of the Holy Roman Emperor would alternate between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the Habsburg family, the German princes in the empire were keen to ensure a clear distinction whereby the Austrian Habsburgs remained the Holy Roman Emperors going forward. Nevertheless, over the generations, the two branches of the dynasty frequently intermarried in order to maintain close dynastic links. As a result, Charles II of Spain's paternal grandfather, Philip III of Spain, was also his maternal great-grandfather, while his maternal great-grandfather, Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II, was the brother of his paternal grandmother, Margarita of Austria. It was a striking level of inbreeding between the Austrian and Spanish branches of the family. Such an extent of inbreeding among the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs resulted in successive generations of Habsburgs having prominent jaws to the extent that their lower teeth extended beyond the upper teeth, preventing them from closing their mouths properly. In addition to such genetic defects as the Habsburg jaw, extensive inbreeding caused other health problems and limited the prospects of royal children surviving into adulthood. Prior to Charles II's birth, 6 out of his mother's previous 8 children were stillborn or died shortly after birth. The others were the Infanta Margarita and the sickly Felipe Prospero, who died a month shy of his 4th birthday on the 1st of November 1661. For Philip and Mariana, the birth of Prince Carlos 5 days later was regarded as a miracle, a gift from God that gave the Spanish Habsburgs a final chance to continue their dynastic lineage. Witnesses to the birth reported that both Queen Mariana and her child were healthy, though in the context of the Queen's previous stillbirths, it may have been enough for the baby to be considered healthy by virtue of simply still breathing. It soon became clear that the future Charles II suffered from serious health issues and physical deformities that earned him the nickname Carlos the Bewitched among his subjects. While the whole of Europe seemed to be awaiting his imminent death year after year, from even when he was a child, such were the scale of his varied illnesses, Charles would defy expectations and live for almost 40 years. During the reigns of Charles V and his son Philip II in the 16th century, Spain was the leading European power. Spanish armies dominated the battlefields of Europe, and Spanish conquistadors completed the conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires in the Americas. In the Far East, Spanish soldiers even colonized the Philippine Islands, which were named in honor of the king. When Philip became King of Portugal in 1580, after the extinction of the Portuguese House of Aviz, he took control of Portugal's maritime empire, stretching from Brazil to the East Indies. However, while Spanish ships carried vast quantities of Mexican gold and Peruvian and Bolivian silver to Europe, King Philip's reign witnessed a number of setbacks which would contribute to Spain's decline in the 17th century. The influx of precious metals served to devalue coinage in Europe, while the Spanish crown ran up huge debts trying to crush the Protestant Reformation around the continent. In response to higher taxation and the persecution of Protestants, Philip's Dutch subjects rebelled against Spanish rule in 1568. While Spanish forces initially managed to regain control over large parts of the southern parts of the Low Countries around modern-day Belgium, the northern Protestants continued to resist, and in 1581 the Dutch Republic formally declared independence from Spain, aided by England. A few years later, Philip dispatched the Spanish Armada to invade England, but the large Spanish fleet was defeated by a combination of superior British seamanship and poor weather. Shortly after Philip II's death in 1598, the formation of the English and Dutch East India Companies in 1600 and 1603 respectively challenged Spanish maritime supremacy, while Spain suffered from state bankruptcies brought on by overspending. King Philip III of Spain negotiated a truce with the Dutch in 1609. The agreement effectively recognized Dutch independence and did not end the conflict. When the 30 Years' War broke out in 1618, Philip supported his Austrian cousin, Emperor Ferdinand II, by sending Spanish troops to assist imperial forces to defeat Bohemian Protestant nobles at the Battle of White Mountain in November 1620. Although initially successful, Spanish intervention in the 30 Years' War would turn out to be a costly mistake. King Philip IV, the father of Charles II of Spain, succeeded his father, Philip III, in March 1621. Nicknamed the Planet King on account of Spain's extensive colonial possessions, Philip was an ambitious young man who was determined to exhibit Spain's power and grandeur. Victory at the Battle of the White Mountain at the start of the 30 Years' War, alongside his Austrian Habsburg cousins, against the Czech and German Protestants, galvanized the Spanish to renew hostilities in the Netherlands. Spain's policy in the Netherlands and its active role in the Catholic coalition in the 30 Years' War led to a deterioration in relations with France, which allied with the Protestant League. After Spanish and imperial forces defeated a Swedish-led Protestant army at the Battle of Nördlingen in 1634, France declared war on Spain. While the ensuing conflict would last until 1659, France's crushing victory over the Spanish at Rocroi in 1643 marked the end of Spanish military supremacy and the beginning of French hegemony in Europe during the second half of the 17th century. In the Peace of Münster, signed in January 1648, Spain formally recognized Dutch independence after 80 years of resisting it, while retaining control of the southern Netherlands, corresponding roughly to present-day Belgium. In the meantime, Dutch attacks on Portuguese colonies in Indonesia and Brazil encouraged the Portuguese nobility to seek independence from Spanish rule by proclaiming the Duke of Braganza as King John IV of Portugal in December 1640. Spanish armies were regularly defeated in battle during the 1640s and 1650s, and a major Spanish counteroffensive to reconquer Portugal in the 1660s would also prove unsuccessful. In his extensive correspondence with the Abbess Maria de Agreda, Philip IV believed that the calamities that befell Spain were divine punishment for his own sexual promiscuity. For all of the king's regrets and the nuns' prayers, Philip is understood to have fathered over 30 illegitimate children with various mistresses, despite being married twice. As a 10-year-old boy in 1615, Philip married the 13-year-old Elizabeth of France, known in Spain as Queen Isabel. The marriage produced many daughters, of whom only one survived into adulthood, and a single son, Prince Balthazar Carlos. After Isabel's death in October 1644, Philip was keen to arrange the marriage of his beloved son, on whom the hopes of the Spanish House of Habsburg rested. Balthazar Carlos was betrothed to Maria Anna of Austria in 1646, but fell ill and died in early October. In order to retain the political advantages of the match and to produce another male heir, in October 1649 the 44-year-old Philip IV married his 15-year-old niece Maria Anna, known in Spain as Mariana. Events in the Spanish royal bedchamber were closely monitored by international observers eager to find out whether the king would produce another male heir. The birth of Felipe Prospero in 1657 alleviated the crisis, but the boy's poor health continued to put the succession in doubt. Meanwhile, France and Spain were still at war, and with both sides exhausted by the conflict, French ambassadors began to float the prospect of a union between King Louis XIV of France and Infanta Maria Theresa, the surviving daughter of Philip IV and Isabel. The proposed match would bring the French House of Bourbon into the Spanish line of succession, and Queen Mariana desperately sought to prevent it. Her efforts were in vain, and after France and Spain signed the Peace of the Pyrenees in 1659, King Louis married Maria Theresa in 1660. On the 1st of November 1661, the same day that Philippe Prospero died in Spain, his half-sister, Queen Maria Theresa of France, gave birth to a son named Louis. After 1661, kings and ministers all over Europe anticipated a bloody struggle over the Spanish succession between the French Bourbons and the Austrian Habsburgs. All that stood in the way was the frail body of Prince Carlos, soon to be King Charles II of Spain. The traditional narrative of Charles II's life and reign portrays him as an unfortunate individual of weak body and mind who was incapable of making decisions. The physical incapacity of the king reflected the wider decline of Habsburg Spain, and the actions of the king and the Spanish court were determined by international players. After the announcement of Charles's birth, King Louis XIV sent agents to Madrid to offer his congratulations and to determine whether the newborn child was indeed a healthy baby boy. The French delegation reported back that the child appeared to be very feeble, suffered from eczema, and had scales covering his head. They also found out from private conversations that the baby had been exuding pus from the right side of his neck for 3 weeks, a condition that was carefully hidden from the public. Moreover, they had no guarantee that the baby was a boy, and for several years King Louis continued to suspect that the Spanish court had dressed a princess up as a prince. Whatever the child's gender, Louis was convinced that he would not live very long, and he based his foreign policy on the assumption that the Spanish Habsburgs' royal line would soon die out. In anticipation of the succession struggle, he took further steps to weaken Spain by supporting the Portuguese rebellion and tried to conquer some of the remaining Spanish territories in the Low Countries. Thus, Charles, as he grew up with a range of maladies brought about by a century and a half of inbreeding within the Austrian and Spanish branches of the Habsburgs, was the focus of much political scheming around Europe. Charles did not have long to wait to inherit his crown. He was not yet 4 years old when his father, King Philip IV, died on the 17th of September 1665 at the age of 60. A few days before his death, the king reportedly bade farewell to his son by expressing the hope that, quote, "God may make you happier than he made me." The child king was not yet able to walk, never mind exercise his royal powers. In his last will and testament, Philip IV gave his wife, Queen Mariana, extensive powers as regent while their son was still a child. It was common for Habsburg women to exercise significant power during this period. Philip IV's first wife, Queen Isabel, had assumed the regency on several occasions while her husband was campaigning against Catalan rebels. During the first half of the 16th century, the Netherlands had effectively experienced half a century of female rule under Charles V's aunt, Margaret of Austria, and his sister, Mary of Austria. Charles V's long absences from Spain led him to appoint his wife Isabella Portugal as regent until her death in 1539. Queenship in Habsburg Spain was also influenced by powerful medieval queens in Aragon and Castile. The most notable example was Philip and Mariana's distant ancestor, Isabella of Castile, a capable ruler who ruled Castile in her own right. Taking these traditions in mind, Philip IV's will named Mariana as tutor and curator, as well as governor, during Charles II's minority. Although there was a regency council in place and Mariana was expected to consult with the nobles who were members of it, this was an advisory body and did not restrict the Queen Regent's executive authority. Mariana's regency was widely accepted at court, and when she assumed the office at the age of 31, she was already an experienced political operator fully prepared to take on the role. Philip IV explicitly stated in his testament that Mariana was, quote, "to govern in the same manner and with the same authority that I do, and that she has the entire government and direction of all my kingdoms in peace and war, until his successor reached their majority at the age of 14. Mariana, as a member of the Austrian side of the Habsburg family, pursued a strongly pro-Vienna policy during her son's minority. This was in line with what her husband had favoured. King Philip IV had recognized that his son, owing to his many illnesses, could die without an heir, and his testament laid out his intentions in that eventuality. Philip's eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, Queen of France, had been obliged to renounce her claim to the Spanish crown as part of her marriage settlement with King Louis XIV. This left Philip and Mariana's 14-year-old daughter, Margarita Teresa, next in line to the throne. Should the young princess also die, then the throne should pass to the heirs of Philip's younger sister, Empress Maria Anna of Austria, who also happened to be Queen Mariana's mother. Mariana's surviving brother, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, was thus next in line to inherit the Spanish throne, and after that, Mariana herself. In April 1663, 2.5 years before Philip IV's death, Margarita Theresa and Leopold I were betrothed. Since Philip IV stipulated that any successor must reside in Castile, and Leopold I was unlikely to abandon his seat of power in Vienna, the implication is that Mariana would continue to hold power in Spain even after Charles II's death, either as regent for the absent Leopold and Margarita until they produced an heir, or as queen in her own right. Charles II was the only Spanish Habsburg to have become king while still a child, and while he was widely recognized as the legitimate king, his minority posed problems for the Spanish government. Spanish royal princes were traditionally brought up by the Queen's household until they came of age. Although Charles II was already king, this practice was continued, and he was brought up in his mother's household until the king's household was reconstituted a decade later. On the day of Philip IV's death, the king's royal governess, the Marquise of Los Vélez, sat on the royal throne and held the infant in her arms. Cristobal Crespi de Valdaura, head of the Council of Aragon, reported that when he and his ministers went to kiss the hand of the infant king, proceedings were interrupted when Charles began to cry. After being fed, the boy dutifully continued to perform his royal duties. When Crespi expressed his condolences to the king over the death of his father, Charles remained silent, and Los Vélez spoke some words on his behalf. Nevertheless, the transfer of power to Queen Mariana took place efficiently and smoothly. However, while due considerations were made for the king's youth, courtiers found it difficult to adapt to the new state of affairs. On the 8th of November 1665, when Charles was installed as the 9th Master of the Order of the Golden Fleece, he could not preside over the ritual, and the Duke of Cardona was obliged to step in and knight the king. When new knights were inducted into the order, the Marquise of Los Vélez held the king in her lap and placed the order around the recipient's neck herself, attracting comment from foreign male observers who were appalled that knights of the most prestigious military order in Europe received their honours from a mere governess. While such difficulties were unavoidable, Mariana responded to the challenge of the absence of a king's household by providing her son with around 40 meninos, young courtiers who offered companionship to royal children. Assisted by the 4th Marquis of Eterna, a member of the Regency Council, she continued to pay the salaries of the members of her late husband's household and took steps to ensure that a king's household could be in place once Charles reached his majority. While Charles would carry out more ceremonial functions over time until his 14th birthday, political power remained concentrated in the hands of his mother and the Regency Council. In contrast to the traditional narrative that Charles II's education was neglected by his mother, Mariana took her duties overseeing her son's education seriously and took steps to ensure that Charles would be capable of carrying out both his ceremonial and political functions once he came of age. In accordance with Philip IV's testament, Charles II was to begin his political education at the age of 10. Mariana asked her advisor, the Marquis of Eterna, to investigate the appointment of skilled royal tutors, who then appointed Francisco Ramos del Manzano as the king's primary teacher. A distinguished lawyer and statesman, Ramos was a member of the Spanish delegation that concluded the Treaty of the Pyrenees with France in 1659. In 1672, Mariana commissioned Ramos to produce a study on the minority kings, which drew direct parallels between the Emperor Charles V's upbringing, under the supervision of his aunt, Margaret of Austria, and Charles II's upbringing by his mother. Eterna also advised Mariana on the king's courtly education and hired dance teachers and musicians. He personally took charge of Charles's military training by building a miniature fortress in the royal playground and organizing the King's Guard for Charles to review. While Mariana took steps to consolidate her power by making her own appointments to the Regency Council and elevating the Council of State as an instrument of her rule, her government was subject to factionalism. At the heart of the matter were disagreements concerning foreign policy and where the Spanish monarchy should focus its attentions. The veteran Duke of Medina de las Torres proposed making peace with Portugal in order to confront the French threat, while the Count of Peñaranda played down the French threat and favoured continuing the war in Portugal to try to reclaim control over that kingdom. Disagreements were further compounded by Mariana's appointment of her Austrian Jesuit confessor Johann Eberhard Nithard as Grand Inquisitor in 1666, which gave him a seat on the Regency Council. Nithard's foreign origins and his lack of political experience made him a target for the distinguished Spanish statesmen on the council. While Nithard is usually described as a royal favourite, his influence has been overstated and he was effectively assigned to act as the Queen's eyes and ears in the council. A further source of instability came from Don Juan José de Austria. Born in 1629 to Philip IV and the actress Maria Calderon, he was legitimized by the king in 1642, the only one of Philip's illegitimate sons to be recognized. He served as a military commander during his father's reign and enjoyed success in suppressing revolts in Naples and Catalonia, but struggled in Flanders and Portugal. In 1665, when his half-brother succeeded to the throne, he was a healthy 36-year-old man and looked more like a king than the sickly Charles II. Although Don Juan was unexpectedly refused a meeting with Philip IV on his deathbed, the king had asked Mariana to provide for him in his will. After Philip's death, Don Juan quickly sought recognition as a Spanish infante and demanded an official role in the new government. While many Spanish nobles resisted his political machinations, he was appointed an attending member of the Council of State in 1667 and quickly began to challenge the Queen's foreign policy. During the final years of Philip IV's reign, the Spanish monarchy had concentrated a huge proportion of its military resources on re-establishing control over Portugal. But by the time of Philip's death, this was effectively a lost cause, with the new Portuguese royal family having formed a marriage alliance with England. Although many of her courtiers believed that Mariana did not have a right to recognize Portuguese independence on her son's behalf, in 1666 the Queen appointed Medina de las Torres, the Count of Peñaranda, and Nithard to a three-man delegation to negotiate peace with Portugal brokered by the English. In the spring of 1667, King Louis XIV threatened to invade the Spanish Netherlands on the pretext that local laws gave his wife Maria Theresa the right of succession as the eldest surviving child of Philip IV. The Spanish nobility unanimously supported Mariana's refusal to accept the French ultimatum, removing all obstacles for the conclusion of peace with Portugal in January 1668. In response to French invasion, the Spanish army of Flanders increased in size to over 50,000 men, and Mariana organized a triple alliance of England, the Netherlands, and Sweden, which forced Louis to make peace in 1668. Queen Mariana continued to face opposition from Don Juan, who demanded Nithard's dismissal from office in the belief that he was responsible for the government's policies. In early 1668, the Queen responded by appointing Don Juan as governor of the Spanish Netherlands, employing his military talents against the French while keeping him away from Madrid. On the 2nd of June, the Queen ordered the execution of José Mayadas, who was found guilty of a plot to assassinate Nithard on Don Juan's orders. The incident raised alarms about royal tyranny even among Mariana's supporters, and Don Juan intensified his attacks against the Regency government. In order to regain her political capital, Mariana decided to leverage her most important political asset, her son. In early July, the 6-year-old Charles II made his first official public appearance by participating in a procession to the Royal Basilica of Our Lady of Atocha to pay homage to the patron saint of the Spanish monarchy. The young king was loudly acclaimed as he travelled in the royal carriage sitting next to his mother. Don Juan continued his attacks on the government, and soon his secretary's brother Bernardo Patiño was implicated in another attempt to assassinate Nithard. After learning her lesson from the Mayadas incident, the Queen exercised restraint, while Patiño readily divulged details of the plot. This forced Don Juan to leave Madrid, leaving behind a provocative letter that demanded Nithard's dismissal and directly challenged the Queen's authority. The Spanish court was appalled, but with Don Juan threatening to march on Madrid with a small force of cavalry, Mariana was obliged to dismiss Nithard in February 1669 and replace him with her ally Fernando de Valenzuela. With his key demand fulfilled, Don Juan withdrew and temporarily satisfied himself with an appointment as Viceroy of Aragon. To protect herself from similar challenges to her authority in the future, the Queen appointed a Tonna to organize the King's Guard. After the regiment was established, Charles II reviewed the unit in the grounds of the Royal Alcázar of Madrid in July 1669. All of this was occurring while he was king, but still a very ill child. After sidelining Don Juan and consolidating her power at home, Mariana faced a new set of foreign policy challenges. Louis XIV was determined to punish the Dutch for siding against him in the recent war and formed an alliance with King Charles II of England to attack the Netherlands in 1672. While Spain retained good relations with Britain, Spanish ships combined with the Dutch to defeat a French naval force off Gibraltar, maintaining Spanish control of the narrow straits linking the Atlantic with the Mediterranean. Mariana's efforts to obtain diplomatic and military support from her brother Emperor Leopold I were initially unsuccessful, but the death of her daughter and Leopold's wife, Margarita Teresa, in March 1673 weakened the Austrian Habsburgs' claim to the Spanish inheritance and forced Leopold to work more closely with his sister. In July 1673, a formal alliance was established between the Spanish and the Empire. The following year, the new imperial ambassador, the Count of Harrach, presented the Spanish with a proposal for the 13-year-old King Charles II to marry Leopold and Margarita's 4-year-old daughter, Maria Antonia. Although many Spaniards welcomed the prospect of Maria Antonia being sent to Madrid to be brought up as an heir to the Spanish throne in her own right, there was considerable resistance to the idea of her marrying the king. It would be several years before she reached childbearing age, and the imperative was for King Charles to produce an heir as soon as possible, as many believed he would die within just a few years. Such were his growing accumulation of illnesses brought about by the family inbreeding. Mariana was in favour of the union, but her ministers were reluctant, and the king would remain unmarried for another 5 years. The negotiations around King Charles II's marriage reflected the fact that the teenage king was on the verge of attaining his majority. Despite his reputation as an invalid, contemporary reports sometimes described him as an energetic teenager who loved to hunt. While Philip IV's testament envisaged that Mariana would rule on her son's behalf until his 25th birthday, her formal political authority was due to come to an end. She was, therefore, keen to arrange a smooth transition of power that would allow her to remain influential at court. While Mariana had significantly scaled back court entertainments while her son was a child, from 1674 onwards, these festivities were revived. Mariana placed her trusted confidant, Fernando de Valenzuela, in charge of the court entertainments. Valenzuela was responsible for organizing royal progresses and hunting trips for the king. Between April and May 1674, the court moved to the palace at Aranjuez, which became Charles's favourite residence outside Madrid. In April 1675, the king's household was revived, and Charles moved into his own quarters. The Queen remained reluctant to give up her powers, and in early November 1675, 2 days before the Regency was due to end, she and her Regency Council requested an extension of the Regency for another 2 years. To her surprise, Charles II refused, before revealing to her that he had been in contact with Don Juan and intended to bring him to Madrid as his chief political advisor. Mother and son soon reached a compromise, under which she relinquished the Regency on the 6th of November as intended, but the Regency Council remained in place for 2 years with the Queen at its head. When Don Juan arrived in Madrid intending to take up his position at the heart of the new regime, the king was persuaded by his mother to send him away. In order to maintain control of her son's government, she appointed Valenzuela as chief minister. These heavy-handed tactics inspired opposition among the Spanish elite, who saw it as a transparent attempt by the Queen to deny the political rights of her son. After attaining his majority, Charles II struggled to reconcile his desire for political independence from Queen Mariana and his filial responsibilities to her. Further complicating matters was the fact that while he was considered old enough to exercise his full royal prerogatives, he could not marry without his mother's consent. Ignoring the objections of the Spanish nobility, Mariana publicly announced Charles II's engagement with Maria Antonia in September 1676. By late 1676, a large body of Spanish nobles were in open rebellion to Queen Mariana, and in January 1677, reports reached Madrid that Don Juan was marching on the capital with over 15,000 men to resist the proposed marriage. During the crisis, the king solicited advice from the Count of Villombrosa, president of the Council of Castile. The politically neutral Villombrosa argued that the king's obligations to the state superseded those to his mother, and advised him to dismiss the unpopular Valenzuela and take steps to separate himself from his mother. On the night of the 14th of January, the king secretly slipped out of the royal Alcazar palace, leaving Villombrosa the delicate task of informing the Queen the following morning. A few days later, Charles made a journey to the Virgin of Atocha and was cheered by the public. On the 23rd of January, Don Juan arrived in Madrid and quickly took over as the new head of the Regency government. In early March, Queen Mariana was obliged to leave for Toledo. Although efforts were made to give the impression that the Queen had willingly retired, the French and Austrian courts were united in condemning Charles II's decision to exile his mother. It is worth reflecting here on the extent to which Charles was responsible for these decisions, or indeed any others made during his reign as he grew older. Often the last Habsburg king of Spain is relegated to a bit part in his own story, the implication being he was a severely sick child and adult who was basically a chess piece in the dynastic politics of Europe and the court politics of Spain. There is some truth to this. He was extremely ill, though medical historians still debate what he even suffered from. It seems like it was a range of maladies, a proportion of which were undoubtedly caused by nearly 2 centuries of inbreeding amongst the Habsburgs. His primary ailment, many now think, was hydrocephalus, a condition which causes excess cerebrospinal fluids to build up in the brain. This then leads to attendant illnesses and limits the mental development of the sufferer. On top of this, Charles had various physical problems, notably a severely protruding lower jaw. This made it difficult for him to speak properly or even to chew food. And yet, despite all of this, Charles was not completely incapacitated. It is hard to disentangle from the court scheming and the machinations of his extended family members, but there do appear to have been times when he made decisions for himself. As we will see shortly, the foremost of these concerned the changing of his last will and testament shortly before his death, a decision which would have profound consequences for European politics in the early 18th century. Don Juan consolidated his newfound power by moving against his enemies, most notably persuading the king to exile Valenzuela to the Philippines. The new political reality also placed a major obstacle in the path of Charles' proposed marriage to his niece Maria Antonia. Charles's ministers favoured the king's marriage to Louis XIV's niece, Marie Louise of Orléans, who was a few months younger than Charles and of childbearing age. After seeing a painted portrait of her, the king himself was eager to marry the French princess, but neither he nor his ministers wanted to jeopardize the Austrian alliance while hostilities against France continued. Spanish armies had struggled in the Low Countries, and the French supported a successful revolt by Messina in Sicily against Spanish rule between 1675 and 1678. During peace negotiations in Nijmegen in 1678, Spain was obliged to cede the Franche-Comté in eastern France alongside several towns in the Spanish Netherlands. The peace treaty, which Charles ratified in January 1679, removed the requirement for direct Austrian military assistance. However, Charles II was still keen to prevent a break with his Austrian cousins, and as Charles's mother and Leopold's sister, Queen Mariana was invited to play a role in the discussions with the Austrian court. It was through her diplomatic efforts that Leopold was appeased by the breaking of the engagement with Maria Antonia, and Mariana also played a key role in communicating Charles's intentions to the French court, paving the way for Charles's marriage to Marie Louise by proxy in August 1679, prior to their union in person in November. Mariana was on her way to regaining her influence at court, and her reputation improved as Don Juan was criticized for giving away so much to the French. Don Juan suddenly fell ill in late August and died weeks later in September. Even before his death, he was politically isolated, and before the end of the month, Queen Mariana was back in Madrid. While Charles was reconciled with his mother, Mariana acknowledged that she no longer had a formal political role, but remained an influential figure at court. A few months after Don Juan's death, Charles appointed Juan Francisco, the 8th Duke of Medinaceli, as his chief minister. A nobleman of distinguished pedigree who held 7 aristocratic titles simultaneously, Medinaceli had supported the coup that brought Don Juan to power in 1677, but remained a conduit between the king and his mother during her exile in Toledo. Nobody can really be sure the degree to which Charles was responsible for these decisions during these years. He was still just a teenager by modern standards, and he suffered from a profound range of maladies, including reduced cognitive abilities and illnesses which often left him bedbound for days. One of Medinaceli's most important tasks was to address the economic crisis that plagued the country. Philip IV's costly wars meant that when Charles II became king, around 70% of Spanish royal revenues were being used to repay creditors. Although military expenditures during Charles II's reign were far lower than during his father's, the frequent wars against Louis XIV continued to place a significant burden on royal finances. Among the measures Charles and his ministers took to improve state revenues included striking deals with localities to pay tax arrears in part, and laying claim to a greater share of the wealth flowing from the Americas. During wartime, Charles frequently resorted to imposing donativos, or voluntary monetary gifts, from his subjects in order to top up government revenues. One of Medinaceli's most significant reforms was a drastic devaluation of the currency to 25% of its previous value. While the measure represented a major dislocation to trade and credit markets and caused many bankruptcies, the deflationary policy resulted in lower commodity prices. In 1681, only 3 years after the Peace of Nijmegen, Louis XIV once again initiated hostilities by seeking to take over Strasbourg and Luxembourg from the Spanish to expand France's eastern frontiers. Although formally part of the Holy Roman Empire, Luxembourg was controlled by Spain as part of the Spanish Netherlands. In 1682, Louis temporarily withdrew his forces from Luxembourg while the Ottoman Empire advanced against the Holy Roman Empire to lay siege to Vienna in 1683, but after Vienna was liberated in September, the King of France renewed the siege of Luxembourg, initiating what came to be known as the War of the Reunions. With the aid of the Marquis de Vauban, one of history's greatest military engineers, the French army captured the formidable fortress in June 1684. The Truce of Ratisbon, signed by French, Imperial and Spanish representatives in August 1684, ceded Strasbourg and Luxembourg to France. Charles II's chief minister, Medinaceli, was held responsible for the loss of Luxembourg and was dismissed from office in April 1685. He was succeeded by the Count of Oropesa, who largely continued his predecessor's economic policies. A further revaluation of the currency in 1686, at a higher rate than the revaluation of 1680, helped to stabilize the economy, and Oropesa also helped the king reduce court expenditures by allowing posts to remain vacant. In 1687, Oropesa established the post of Superintendent General of Finances and appointed his cousin, the 6th Marquis of Los Vélez, the son of Charles II's governess. Los Vélez's efforts to shift the tax burden from the masses to wealthier nobles were unsuccessful because the government was dependent on the millones, an indirect tax on the sale of food. Noble opposition to Oropesa's economic policies compelled him to resign his government position in June 1691. While the economic and financial reforms introduced by Medinaceli and Oropesa failed to meet the demands of military expenditure, more efficient tax collection methods did lay the foundations for Spain's economic recovery after Charles II's death. With his ministers responsible for day-to-day government administration, the king's most important political task was to produce an heir with his French queen, known in Spain as Maria Louisa. The couple shared a love of music, and the queen was an accomplished musician and singer. According to reports, Charles appears to have made great efforts in the marital bed, but the queen remained barren. While Charles's health issues are likely to have been the cause, the queen was blamed for her lack of fertility, which contributed to her general unpopularity in Spain, while Louis XIV's aggressive designs on the Spanish Netherlands led to fierce arguments with Charles, who accused her of being a French spy. As a result of these factors, Maria Louisa sank into deep depression by the mid-1680s. Then, after a riding accident in early 1689, Maria Louisa fell seriously ill and died on the 12th of February at the age of 26. The widowed King Charles II was now 27 years old and still without an heir. Amidst rumours that the late Queen had been poisoned, Charles's ministers launched another search for a bride who could offer salvation to the Spanish Habsburg line before the seriously ill king died. While Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, had shown genuine grief at the passing of her daughter-in-law, she and Charles's ministers were determined to choose a non-French candidate as his next wife. Charles's former fiancée, Maria Antonia, was no longer available, since she had been married to Elector Maximilian Emmanuel of Bavaria in 1685. By now, Emperor Leopold had 5 more daughters with his third wife, Eleanor Magdalena of Neuburg, but the eldest was only 9 years old. The Spanish government therefore decided on the Empress's younger sister, Maria Anna of Neuburg. Charles II and Maria Anna were married by proxy in August 1689, although the new queen had a difficult journey to Spain and the pair were not married formally until May 1690. By this point, Spain was once again at war with France. The Truce of Ratisbon had been a temporary settlement, but Louis XIV was keen to seek permanent recognition from the different parties. When Leopold refused to do so, a French army laid siege to the fortress of Philipsburg on the Rhine in late September 1689. In response to French aggression, in December, Leopold formed a grand alliance with William of Orange, who, in addition to being the ruler of the Netherlands, had now become King William III of England after the Glorious Revolution of late 1688 had led to the overthrow of the Roman Catholic King James II. Spain joined the anti-French coalition in spring 1690, determined to reclaim land that had recently been lost to France. Much of the fighting took place in the region of the Rhine and the Spanish Netherlands. In 1689, a French force under the Duc de Noailles marched into Catalonia to support peasant uprisings against Charles II, but by 1690, the French were driven back to Roussillon. By 1692, the Spanish army of Lombardy was part of a coalition force under Victor Amadeus that penetrated into southern France, but the offensive ran out of steam and the Allies were defeated in 1693, which saw the French make gains across all fronts. By 1694, a financial crisis in France and successful Allied recruitment efforts meant that the French were now outnumbered on multiple fronts. Spain would remain part of the coalition, but even as late as 1697, Charles considered personally taking to the field at the head of an army to defeat the enemy. By 1695, Allied forces were recapturing fortresses in the Spanish Netherlands, and King Louis recognized that the war could not be won. His desire to make peace was strengthened by his belief that the King of Spain was going to die soon, and he hoped that a favorable peace settlement with Spain could strengthen his claim. After peace negotiations opened in the Netherlands in May 1697, a series of agreements were concluded between the belligerent parties in September and October. While the agreement at Ryswyck settled many of the territorial disputes in the Low Countries and was enthusiastically welcomed in Spain, it did not settle the question of the Spanish succession. Charles II was now 36 years old and had been king for more than 3 decades. Despite occasional rumours of the Queen's pregnancy, his efforts in the royal bedchamber had still not produced an heir, and his health was in increasingly poor shape. The previous year, after Charles had recovered from a bout of illness, the British ambassador, Alexander Stanhope, reported to London that his condition is so weak and broken much beyond his age that it is generally feared what may be the success of another attack. Even during the early 1690s, it was widely accepted that Charles was incapable of producing an heir, and the court was split over who should inherit the empire upon his death. While neither Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, nor his wife, Queen Maria Anna, wanted the French Bourbons to claim the inheritance, the two royal women favoured different alternatives. Charles's wife supported the claims of her sister's second son with Emperor Leopold, Archduke Charles of Austria. Charles's mother favoured the succession of one of her direct descendants. In December 1692, Maria Antonia died shortly after giving birth to a son, Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. Queen Mariana therefore championed her great-grandson's claim to the Spanish inheritance rather than those of her Habsburg nephews. The issue remained unresolved at the time of Mariana's death in May 1696, but a few months later, Charles II signed a will declaring Joseph Ferdinand the heir to the Spanish monarchy after his Council of State determined that the young German prince was a neutral candidate amidst the competing French and Austrian claims. After the Queen Mother's death, her ally, Cardinal Portocarrero, the Archbishop of Toledo, was determined to prevent Queen Maria Anna from persuading her husband to alter his will in favour of the Austrian Habsburgs. Although the details of Charles's will were not widely publicised, his hand, or at least that of those who were actually in charge of Madrid, was forced in October 1698 after negotiations between Louis XIV and William III. French, British and Dutch representatives signed the Treaty of The Hague, recognising Joseph Ferdinand as the heir to the majority of the Spanish lands, including the Spanish Netherlands, while offering Sicily and Naples to the Bourbons and the Duchy of Milan to Archduke Charles of Austria as compensation. Charles II resented the fact that his empire was being carved up by foreign powers behind his back, and in November 1698 he publicised his will designating Joseph Ferdinand as his sole heir. These arrangements were short-lived, as Joseph Ferdinand died suddenly in Brussels at the age of 6 on the 6th of February 1699. His death destroyed any hopes among the Spanish nobles that the empire would remain independent of France or Austria. The death of Joseph Ferdinand led many Spanish nobles to support the French claim over that of Austria, arguing that France, rather than Austria, was better placed militarily and geographically to protect Spain. Among the converts to the pro-French party was Cardinal Portocarrero, who was determined to keep the Austrians out. Meanwhile, Louis XIV and William III reopened negotiations and concluded the Treaty of London in March 1700, naming Archduke Charles as heir to most of the Spanish Empire. Otherwise, most of the provisions of the Treaty of The Hague remained unchanged, though France was to exchange Sicily and Naples for the counties of Savoy and Nice with Victor Amadeus of Savoy, and acquire the duchies of Lorraine and Milan. While Emperor Leopold was not opposed to a partition in exchange for his son becoming the King of Spain, he refused to cede Milan and Lorraine to France. The Spanish court continued to resist the prospect of partition, and King Charles announced that Archduke Charles would inherit the Spanish monarchy undivided. By the summer of 1700, it became increasingly clear that the King of Spain was not likely to survive the year. He fell ill in September and was no longer able to eat. In early October, he was persuaded by Cardinal Portocarrero to alter his will in favour of Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's second eldest grandson, who was not in the direct line of succession to the French throne, on the condition that he renounce any claims to the French succession. This was one of his last official acts. On the 1st of November 1700, Charles II died 5 days short of his 39th birthday, exactly 39 years after the death of his elder brother, Felipe Prospero. His autopsy found that he had, quote, a very small heart, lungs corroded, rotten and gangrenous intestines, 3 large kidney stones, a single testicle black as coal, and his head full of water. It was a miracle that he had survived for so long, but his long-awaited death set the stage for the long and bloody conflict that the whole of Europe had been anticipating. 2 weeks after Charles's death, Philip of Anjou was proclaimed King Philip V of Spain. Despite the conditions in Charles's will, King Louis XIV recognized his grandson as King of Spain, but did not exclude him from the line of succession to the French throne. The prospect of a united Franco-Spanish monarchy was bitterly opposed by the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands and England, and the War of the Spanish Succession broke out in March 1701. While Philip V enjoyed the support of much of Spain, the Aragonese nobility backed the candidacy of Archduke Charles. The Bourbons retained a strong position in Spain, and King Philip abolished the Crown of Aragon in 1707, but the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy combined to inflict heavy defeats on Louis XIV's generals in Germany and the Low Countries. The diplomatic position shifted in 1711 when Archduke Charles succeeded his childless brother Joseph I as Holy Roman Emperor. The potential for a combined Austro-Spanish Empire was also opposed by the British and Dutch, paving the way for peace negotiations at Utrecht in 1713. Under the agreement, King Philip V retained his Spanish kingdom, but was obliged to renounce his claims to the French throne and cede large parts of the Spanish Empire in Europe to his rivals. Britain received Gibraltar and Menorca. Charles VI received the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sardinia, while Savoy received Sicily and parts of Milan. Although Philip V later attempted to challenge the Utrecht settlement by unsuccessfully seeking to regain former Spanish territories in Italy, the War of Spanish Succession resulted in the partition of the Spanish Empire as it had been under the Habsburgs. King Charles II of Spain's desire to pass on his inheritance undivided went unfulfilled. Charles II is usually seen as a tragic figure, blighted by several generations of inbreeding which prevented him from carrying out his most important task as king, to produce an heir to the throne. While he performed some of his ceremonial duties as king throughout his life, political power ultimately lay in the hands of others. During the first decade of his reign, power was in the hands of his mother, Queen Mariana, in her capacity as Queen Regent. After Charles came of age in 1675, he began to assert his political independence to a very limited extent, and his intervention to separate himself from his mother was crucial in preventing civil war in Spain. After his half-brother Don Juan's brief regime, Charles placed his government in the hands of able ministers who attempted to introduce reforms to improve the Spanish economy. Charles's reign witnessed frequent wars with France, and Spain was often obliged to make concessions after suffering defeat at the hands of superior French armies. However, while Spanish troops had a poor battle record during Charles II's reign, Spain retained a large army whose presence on several fronts in conflicts such as the 9 Years' War tied down large numbers of enemy troops and allowed allies to act more aggressively. By the 1690s, upon recognizing that he would not have a child of his own, Charles signalled his determination to bequeath an undivided realm to his successor by naming Joseph Ferdinand, Archduke Charles, and Philip of Anjou as his heir in quick succession. While Charles ultimately failed to do so, like its unfortunate king, the Habsburg monarchy in Spain remained remarkably resilient in spite of the odds. Charles had kept much of his empire in one piece during his reign, and he laid the foundations for the economic recovery that Philip V enjoyed at the beginning of the 18th century. What do you think of King Charles II of Spain? Do you think he was so ill throughout his life that he was simply a pawn of the dynastic politics of his wider family at the Spanish court in Madrid? Or was he a key political and diplomatic player who had his own agency in addressing the challenges facing the Spanish monarchy and determining the fate of his empire after his death? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.